On a bitter January morning in 2006, in a small New Hampshire town where everyone knew everyone and strangers were noticed immediately, a young mother placed a call that would echo through 2 decades. Her voice trembled as she reported her husband missing from their modest home on Berry Mill Road. The snow had fallen steadily through the night, blanketing the rural community in white silence. By the time investigators arrived, the only tracks leading away from the property were those of emergency vehicles carving fresh paths through the powder. The husband, a 34-year-old construction worker named Michael Jennings, had seemingly vanished without trace, without coat, without his truck that sat frozen in the driveway. His wife, Rebecca, stood in the doorway with their 2 young children clinging to her legs, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air as she recounted the last time she had seen him. But as deputies began their initial walkthrough of the property, something felt wrong. Not the absence itself, but the way absence had been arranged. The coffee pot sat cold and full. The bed appeared slept in on only one side, and in the mudroom Michael's boots stood in perfect parallel alignment, as though placed rather than kicked off. The question that would haunt investigators for 18 years began to form even then, unspoken but persistent. What if he never left at all? The town of Thornfield, New Hampshire, population 2,300, sat nestled in the Merrimack Valley like a secret kept by the surrounding pine forests. It was the kind of place where the general store still operated on an honor system for early morning coffee, where the volunteer fire department held pancake breakfasts every 3rd Sunday, and where newcomers needed a decade before they were considered anything other than outsiders. The main road cut through town like a spine, lined with colonial-era homes that had weathered 2 centuries of New England seasons. Beyond the modest downtown, single-lane roads branched into the woods, leading to properties measured in acres rather than lots. Berry Mill Road was one of these arterial routes, a winding stretch of cracked asphalt that climbed gradually into the foothills. The Jennings property sat 3 miles from the town center, a 1-story ranch house painted pale yellow with white trim, built in the 1970s when such homes sprouted across rural America like mushrooms after rain. The house sat on 4 acres, mostly wooded, with a gravel driveway that curved from the road to a detached garage. A rusted swing set stood in the side yard, and a woodpile covered with a blue tarp leaned against the back of the house. In January, when the deciduous trees stood bare and the evergreens sagged under snow, you could see the nearest neighbor's chimney smoke rising about a 1/4 mile to the east. Michael Jennings had lived in Thornfield his entire life. His father had worked at the paper mill before it closed in 1998. Michael had found work with a regional construction company, the kind that built additions and replaced roofs, that worked when weather permitted and collected unemployment when it did not. He was known as reliable if not exceptional, a man who showed up on time and did what was asked without complaint or innovation. Those who worked alongside him described a quiet person, someone who kept his thoughts close and his words few. Rebecca had arrived in Thornfield 7 years earlier, in 1999, taking a job as a dental hygienist at the only practice in town. She had grown up 3 towns over, in a slightly larger community with a strip mall and a chain restaurant. In Thornfield, she was noticed immediately, the way any young single woman would be in a place where the ratio of available partners skewed toward those who had never left or those who had returned after failure elsewhere. She and Michael had married quickly, within 8 months of meeting, in a small ceremony at the Methodist Church on the Common. Their children were 5 and 3 that January. The older one, a boy named Connor, attended kindergarten at the elementary school. The younger, a girl named Emma, stayed home with Rebecca on the days she did not work. By all accounts visible to neighbors and acquaintances, they were unremarkable, a young family navigating the ordinary challenges of rural life on modest means. January 14, 2006, began as Saturdays did in winter. The forecast had predicted snow, and the prediction had proven accurate. By dawn, 4 inches had accumulated, with more falling steadily. Michael's construction crew had no work scheduled. The plan, as Rebecca would later tell investigators, was for Michael to sleep late, then plow the driveway with the small blade attachment on his truck. She had risen early with the children, made breakfast, settled them in front of the television with cartoons playing on low volume. The house was quiet in the way houses are when snow muffles the outside world. No cars passed on Berry Mill Road. No wind rattled the windows. Inside, the radiators clicked and hissed, struggling against the cold that seeped through imperfect insulation. The children ate cereal at the kitchen table. Rebecca moved through the morning routine, washing dishes, folding laundry, glancing occasionally toward the bedroom where Michael presumably slept. According to the timeline she provided, she checked on him around 9:30. She pushed open the bedroom door, expecting to find him still in bed, but the room was empty. The blankets were pulled back on his side. His pillow showed the indentation of a head. She called his name. No answer came. She walked through the small house, checking the bathroom, the living room, the basement stairs. His truck sat in the driveway, covered in fresh snow. His coat hung on its hook by the front door. His wallet rested on the dresser. His cell phone, one of those early flip models with limited service in the area anyway, sat charging on the nightstand. Clear's throat. At 10:15, Rebecca called Michael's brother David, who lived in town above the hardware store. Had he heard from Michael? No. Was he expected somewhere? Not that David knew. At 10:45, she called the Thornfield Police Department, a 3-person operation that shared a building with the town hall. Chief Raymond Porter took the call himself. He arrived at the house at 11:10, driving slowly up the snow-covered driveway in his marked SUV. Rebecca met him at the door, the children now visible behind her, watching with the wide eyes children develop in the presence of uniformed authority. Chief Porter, a man of 53 who had served in the position for 18 years, had known Michael since the boy was in elementary school. He asked the questions required of such calls. When had she last seen him? The previous evening around 10, when they had both gone to bed. Had they argued? No. Was he upset about anything? Not that she could tell. Any reason he might leave voluntarily? None she could think of. Porter walked through the house with the deliberate pace of someone who had been trained but rarely practiced. Thornfield averaged fewer than 12 calls per month, most involving traffic incidents or disputes between neighbors over property lines. The bedroom showed signs of occupancy: rumpled sheets, clothes draped over a chair, an alarm clock blinking 12 because no one had reset it after the last power outage. The bathroom revealed nothing unusual. The basement, accessed through a door in the kitchen, contained the standard accumulation of rural storage: tools, camping equipment, boxes of Christmas decorations, a workbench cluttered with half-finished projects. Outside, Porter examined the perimeter. Fresh snow had covered any tracks that might have existed. The truck, a 1998 Ford F-150, sat locked and cold. No footprints led away from the house in any direction. The garage, when opened, contained the expected collection: lawn equipment, fishing rods, a kayak on sawhorses. Nothing appeared disturbed. By noon, Porter had called the New Hampshire State Police. By 1, a detective from the Major Crime Unit had been assigned. By 2, additional personnel were en route. What had begun as a missing person report was transforming into something more organized, more serious, more uncertain. Detective Sarah Chen arrived at 3:30, bringing with her the protocols developed for cases that might become complicated. She was 38, based in Concord, experienced in the methodical work of investigation that often proved thankless. She interviewed Rebecca separately, establishing baseline information. She examined the house again, this time with gloved hands and evidence bags. She photographed every room from multiple angles. She collected Michael's toothbrush, his hairbrush, items that might provide DNA if DNA became necessary. The search began in earnest Sunday morning. 20 volunteers from Thornfield and surrounding towns gathered in the parking lot of the elementary school. They were organized into teams of 4, given sectors on maps, instructed on what to look for and what not to touch. The temperature had dropped overnight, settling into the teens. The snow had stopped, leaving the world crystalline and still. They walked in lines through the woods surrounding the Jennings property. They checked the frozen creek that ran through a culvert under Berry Mill Road. They knocked on doors at every house within 2 miles, asking if anyone had seen anything, heard anything, noticed anything unusual. Most people answered with variations of the same response. Quiet night, heavy snow, saw nothing, heard nothing. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Margaret Hastings who lived alone in a farmhouse a half-mile down the road, mentioned seeing headlights pass her window sometime after midnight, but she could not be certain of the time or the direction, and headlights on Berry Mill Road were not unusual enough to merit particular attention. Clear's throat. By Sunday evening, the search had expanded to a 5-mile radius. Dogs were brought in, the kind trained to follow scent trails. They circled the property, moved in seemingly random patterns, found nothing that led anywhere conclusive. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging flew grid patterns overhead, seeking heat signatures in the frozen landscape. They detected deer, a fox, the warm roofs of occupied houses, but nothing that resembled a person on foot or a person lying still. Rebecca remained at the house with her children. She gave multiple interviews, answered the same questions in slightly different formulations. Detectives noticed small things, details that might mean nothing or might mean everything. She seemed composed, almost eerily so, considering her husband had been missing more than 24 hours in sub-freezing temperatures. She did not cry during the initial interviews. When asked to describe their marriage, she used words like fine and normal, adjectives that suggested nothing while saying little. When asked if Michael had any enemies, any debts, any secrets, she shook her head and repeated that everything was fine, everything was normal. David Jennings, Michael's brother, told a slightly different story, not contradictory exactly but shaded differently. He described Michael as withdrawn lately, quieter than usual, which for Michael meant nearly silent. Had Michael seemed depressed, David hesitated before answering. Maybe. It was hard to tell with Michael, who kept everything internal. Did the brothers spend much time together? Some. Beers after work occasionally. Holidays, family dinners. But Michael was not the type to share feelings or problems. He carried his burdens alone. Investigators pulled Michael's financial records. They revealed a life lived paycheck to paycheck, with the occasional overdraft but nothing suggesting serious debt or illegal activity. His bank account showed a balance of $347. His credit card had a balance of $1,200, well below its limit. His truck payment was current. There were no large withdrawals, no suspicious transfers, no pattern suggesting preparation for disappearance. They examined his phone records. The cell had made no calls after 9:15 on Friday night, when he had received a call from a coworker confirming that Saturday's work was canceled due to weather. Before that, the records showed a mundane pattern: calls to Rebecca, calls to his brother, calls to work numbers, occasional calls to the pizza place in town. Nothing suggested a secret life or hidden relationship. They interviewed his coworkers. All described Michael the same way: dependable, quiet, kept to himself. No one had noticed anything unusual in recent weeks. No one had heard him mention plans to leave or problems at home. He showed up, did the work, collected his pay, went home. When asked directly if they thought Michael capable of simply walking away from his life, most paused before answering, then said they supposed anyone was capable of anything, but it did not seem like something Michael would do. As Monday became Tuesday, as Tuesday became Wednesday, a pattern emerged in the investigation. Every avenue led to the same dead end. No body, no evidence of foul play, no evidence of voluntary departure, no witnesses, no leads. Michael Jennings had seemingly evaporated from his bedroom while his wife and children slept in the next rooms, leaving behind every possession, every means of transportation, every connection to the life he had built. Detective Chen returned to the house repeatedly. She walked through the rooms again and again, looking for what she might have missed. She examined the bedroom closet, noting that Michael's clothes hung undisturbed. She checked the bathroom, finding his medications in the cabinet, his razor by the sink. She studied the kitchen, seeing nothing that suggested a struggle or hurried departure. She stood in the mudroom, staring at those boots positioned with unnatural precision. On Thursday, a week after the disappearance, Chen sat across from Rebecca at the kitchen table. The children were at Rebecca's mother's house, giving the adults space to talk. Chen asked about the marriage again, probing more directly this time. Was everything really fine? Rebecca maintained that it was. They had their struggles like any couple, but nothing serious. Money was tight sometimes. Michael worked long hours in season, but they managed. They were planning to stay together, to raise their children, to build the life they had started. Chen asked about Michael's state of mind. Rebecca said he seemed normal. Chen asked if Michael had ever been violent. Rebecca's answer came too quickly. No, never. Chen asked if Rebecca had ever been afraid of Michael. Rebecca said no, but her eyes moved to the window as she said it, and Chen noted the displacement in her report. Those who knew Rebecca during that first week said she seemed to be holding something back, but what she was holding remained unclear. Was it grief, guilt, knowledge, fear? She moved through the days like someone walking through deep water, each step requiring effort, each word carefully selected before being released into the air. The search continued through the second week, but with diminishing resources. Volunteers returned to their lives. State police redirected personnel to active cases. The media, which had covered the story with moderate interest initially, moved on to other mysteries. By the end of January, the investigation had slowed to occasional follow-up calls and periodic reviews of the file. Michael Jennings had vanished, and the world, having looked for him briefly and intensely, began to forget. Part 2. The investigation. The Thornfield Fire Department organized a second large-scale search on February 4th, 3 weeks after Michael's disappearance. 70 volunteers gathered despite temperatures hovering near zero. They spread across a 10-mile radius, checking abandoned buildings, searching the shores of Miller Pond, where ice fishermen had recently reported seeing unusual disturbances, walking fence lines and property boundaries in areas not covered during initial searches. They found nothing. A member of the search party, a veteran of the state's Fish and Game Department who had participated in dozens of missing person searches over his career, was overheard saying to another volunteer that in his experience, when someone went missing in winter without a coat and left no trail, the outcome was almost always tragic. Either the person had been taken somewhere by someone, or the person had walked into the woods with intention and succumbed to the cold. The fact that Michael's body had not been found suggested the first option more than the second, because bodies in winter stayed preserved, stayed findable, at least until spring thaw. Detective Chen continued working the case with the persistence of someone who understood that most cases were solved not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through the slow accumulation of inconsistencies. She built timelines on large sheets of paper spread across her desk in Concord. She mapped out everyone's movements on January 13th and 14th. She cross-referenced statements, looking for discrepancies. Rebecca had said she last saw Michael around 10 on Friday night. They had gone to bed at the same time. She had fallen asleep before him, which was typical. She woke once during the night to use the bathroom, around 2:30, and Michael was in bed beside her. The next time she woke was 7:15 Saturday morning, and she assumed Michael was still sleeping when she got up with the children. But Chen found problems with this timeline. Rebecca worked Friday afternoon, her last appointment ending at 4:30. She picked up the children from the sitter, a woman named Joan who lived on the opposite end of town. Joan confirmed Rebecca arrived at 5, right on schedule. Rebecca said she drove home, made dinner, bathed the children, put them to bed around 8. She and Michael watched television for a while, then went to bed around 10. Michael's brother David had called the house Friday evening around 8:30, wanting to know if Michael wanted to go ice fishing Saturday morning. Rebecca had answered and said Michael was putting Connor to bed. David said he would call back, but his phone records showed he never did. When Chen asked why he had not called back, David shrugged and said he had gotten distracted, forgotten, figured he would see Michael around town anyway. A coworker who lived near Berry Mill Road told Chen he had driven past the Jennings house around 9 on Friday night and noticed all the lights were off except one in the front window. This struck him as slightly unusual because he often passed the house in the evenings, and typically multiple rooms were lit. He had not thought much of it at the time but mentioned it when Chen interviewed him a second time, asking about anything he might have observed, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Chen returned to the house and asked Rebecca about the lights. Rebecca said she had no specific memory of which lights were on or off. It was possible she had turned off most lights early. It was possible they were trying to save on the electric bill. It was possible the coworker was mistaken about which night he had seen the darkened house. Clears throat. Investigators examined the vehicle Michael had driven, the Ford truck sitting in the driveway. The odometer read 73,412 miles. Chen obtained records from the last time Michael had put gas in the truck, January 10th at the Cumberland Farms in Thornfield. The receipt showed the odometer at 73,380 miles at that fill-up. Between January 10th and January 14th, the truck had accumulated 32 miles. Chen mapped out the distances. Michael's worksite that week had been 15 miles away. Round trip each day meant 30 miles. He had worked Monday through Wednesday, then received the call Wednesday evening that the crew was finished for the week due to incoming weather. That accounted for 90 miles. But the odometer only showed an increase of 32 miles from the January 10th fill-up. When Chen confronted Rebecca with this discrepancy, Rebecca appeared confused. She did not track Michael's driving. He might have filled up more than once. He might have filled up elsewhere. The receipt from January 10th might not have been his most recent fill-up. Chen checked all gas stations within reasonable distance. None had records of Michael's credit card being used after January 10th. The truck itself revealed no forensic evidence of value, no blood, no signs of struggle. The interior was messy in the way work trucks often are. Fast food wrappers, empty coffee cups, tools rolling around the footwells. The bed contained wood scraps and a tarp. Everything appeared normal except the snow that had accumulated on and around it. Snow that had begun falling Friday night and continued through Saturday morning. Snow that should have been disturbed if someone had accessed the truck Saturday morning, but which lay smooth and undisturbed, when investigators first photographed it Saturday afternoon. Rebecca had mentioned Michael's plan to plow the driveway Saturday morning, but when had she learned of this plan? She could not remember exactly. It was just understood. When it snowed, Michael plowed. But if he had intended to plow Saturday morning, why was the truck covered in snow when deputies arrived? If he had disappeared Friday night, the timeline made more sense. But Rebecca maintained she had seen him in bed at 2:30 Saturday morning. Chen asked if she was certain about the time. Rebecca hesitated, then said she was fairly certain. She had looked at the clock when she got up to use the bathroom. It might have been 2:20 or 2:40, but it was around 2:30. And Michael was definitely in bed. She had felt his presence, the weight of him on the mattress, the sound of his breathing. Chen asked if she had touched him. Rebecca said no. Chen asked if she had seen his face. Rebecca said no, the room was dark. Chen asked how she could be certain it was Michael if she had not touched him or seen him. Rebecca's face flushed, and she said of course it was Michael. Who else would it have been? They were married. She knew when her husband was beside her in bed. Deputies and investigators whispered quietly among themselves about the wife who did not cry, who answered questions with rehearsed precision, who seemed more concerned with maintaining a story than with the fact that her husband was missing in freezing temperatures. But suspicion was not evidence, and without evidence, the investigation could only circle the same territory repeatedly. The town of Thornfield watched and formed opinions. Those who had known Michael longer sided with confusion over suspicion. He was not the type to leave, they said, but he was also not the type to provoke violence. If something had happened, it had happened quietly, without witnesses, without drama. Others, particularly women who knew Rebecca from the dental practice or saw her at the grocery store, said they had noticed tension in the marriage. The way Rebecca's smile never quite reached her eyes when she spoke about Michael. The way she sometimes wore long sleeves even in summer. The state police conducted polygraph examinations on both Rebecca and David. Rebecca consented after initially refusing on advice from an attorney she had consulted. The examiner noted that she showed deception on questions about whether she knew what had happened to Michael and whether she had told the complete truth about the night he disappeared. But polygraph results were not admissible in court, and the test was imperfect at best. Rebecca's attorney released a statement saying the test results were meaningless, that Rebecca was under immense stress, that the examination had been conducted improperly. David's polygraph showed no deception, but investigators noted his limited knowledge of his brother's day-to-day life. The brothers were not particularly close despite living in the same small town. They saw each other occasionally, but did not confide in each other. In March, as snow began to melt and mud season arrived, search teams went out again, checking areas that had been inaccessible during winter. They walked creek beds and ravines. They searched the woods behind the property with renewed attention. They brought cadaver dogs to specific locations flagged during earlier searches as possible sites of interest. They found nothing. By April, the investigation had effectively stalled. Detective Chen submitted her reports and moved on to other cases, though she kept the Jennings file on her desk, reviewing it periodically when time allowed. Chief Porter in Thornfield occasionally drove past the Berry Mill Road property, noting the signs of life continuing. Children playing in the yard, laundry on the line, Rebecca's car coming and going according to her work schedule. Michael's mother, a woman named Patricia who lived in a retirement community 2 towns over, gave an interview to the local newspaper in May. She spoke about her son as a boy, quiet and kind, someone who helped her with chores without being asked, who had never given her trouble. She said she did not believe he had simply walked away. She said something terrible had happened, and someone knew what it was, and someday the truth would emerge. When asked if she suspected anyone, she said no, but her eyes told a different story. The case went cold not with a dramatic conclusion, but with a gradual diminishment of attention. The file remained open. Michael's name stayed in databases. His photograph appeared on missing person websites, but active investigation ceased. The question of what happened to Michael Jennings joined the long list of mysteries that haunt small towns. Stories told in bars and break rooms, cases that people reference when discussing the darkness that can exist beneath familiar surfaces. For those who have ever doubted someone you love, who have felt the slow erosion of trust without being able to name its cause, the Jennings case resonated. It asked uncomfortable questions about how well we know the people we sleep beside, the private selves hidden behind public faces, the capacity for deception in those we have chosen to trust. And the years passed. Part 3: The Silence. By the autumn of 2006, Rebecca had stopped attending church. The Methodist congregation where she and Michael had married had welcomed her during the initial weeks after his disappearance, bringing casseroles and offering prayers, organizing meal trains and childcare assistance. But as months passed without resolution, as whispers of suspicion grew louder than expressions of sympathy, Rebecca found the services unbearable. She felt eyes on her during hymns. She heard her name in conversations that stopped when she approached. She knew what people were thinking because she could read it in their faces, in the way they smiled too brightly at her children while studying her for signs of guilt. She continued working at the dental practice, but her hours were reduced. The dentist, a man named Dr. Palmer who had employed her for 7 years, said the reduction was due to declining patient volume, but Rebecca understood the unspoken reason. People did not want their teeth cleaned by a woman suspected of making her husband disappear. They requested the other hygienist. They rescheduled appointments. They found dentists in other towns. Money became tighter. Michael's construction income had never been substantial, but it had covered a significant portion of their expenses. Now Rebecca struggled with the mortgage, with daycare costs, with the endless small expenses of raising children. She applied for assistance and received it, standing in line at the social services office with the shame peculiar to those who had once believed themselves self-sufficient. Connor started first grade that fall. His teacher, a woman named Mrs. Henley who had taught in Thornfield for 20 years, noticed behaviors that concerned her. The boy was withdrawn, reluctant to participate in activities, quick to anger when other children asked about his father. He drew pictures during free time, always the same image: a house with dark windows and a figure standing alone in the yard. When Mrs. Henley asked who the figure was, Connor shrugged and said he did not know. Emma, the younger child, developed nightmares. She woke screaming several nights a week, crying for her father, asking when he was coming home. Rebecca had no answers that satisfied a 4-year-old mind. She said Daddy was away, Daddy would come back when he could, Daddy loved her very much. But the words sounded hollow even to Rebecca, who spoke them while holding her daughter in the dark, feeling the weight of lies and half-truths accumulating like stones in her chest. Clear's throat. Rebecca's mother, a woman named Linda who lived 40 minutes away, suggested Rebecca move back home, at least temporarily. The old house had room. The children could have stability. Rebecca could save money, figure out next steps, but Rebecca refused. To leave would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that life in Thornfield had become impossible. She was determined to stay, to maintain the appearance of normalcy, to prove to the town and to herself that she could survive this. But surviving and living are different things. Rebecca moved through days like an automaton, performing required tasks without joy or energy. She woke, dressed the children, dropped Connor at school, took Emma to daycare, worked her reduced hours, picked up the children, made dinner, supervised homework, enforced bedtime. Then she sat alone in the living room, watching television without seeing it, drinking wine until sleep came. The house on Berry Mill Road felt different now. The rooms had accumulated a silence that was more than the absence of sound. It was the silence of things unsaid, of questions unasked, of truths locked away. Rebecca had cleaned out Michael's belongings in August, packing his clothes into boxes that she took to the Goodwill donation center 2 towns over, where no one would recognize her or ask questions. She had removed his toothbrush from the bathroom holder. She had deleted his email account and canceled his cell phone service. She had, in small, methodical ways, erased physical evidence of his existence from the house. But she could not erase him from memory or from the constant presence of doubt that had settled over everything. At night, lying alone in the bed they had shared, she sometimes heard sounds. Footsteps in the hallway, the creak of floorboards, the whisper of breath. She knew these sounds were products of an exhausted mind, but knowing did not diminish their power to terrify. In November, David Jennings knocked on her door one Saturday morning. Rebecca had not spoken to Michael's brother since early spring. Their relationship, never warm, had cooled to mutual avoidance. David stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, breath visible in the cold air. He asked if they could talk. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Detective Chen had conducted interviews. David asked how she was managing. Rebecca said fine. He asked about the children. She said they were adjusting. He asked if she needed anything. She said no. They sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment, then David said he wanted to believe her, but he could not shake the feeling that she knew more than she had told investigators. Rebecca's face hardened. She said everyone in town thought the same thing, so he was welcome to join them in their suspicions. David said he was not accusing her, exactly, he was just confused. Michael was his brother, and the lack of answers was eating at him. Rebecca said the lack of answers was eating at her too, that she had lost her husband, that her children had lost their father, that her life had been destroyed by Michael's disappearance, and the fact that people suspected her only made it worse. David apologized and left. Rebecca watched his truck drive away, then sat at the table crying for the first time in months. The tears came not from grief but from exhaustion, from the unbearable weight of maintaining composure, from the knowledge that the performance would never end, that she would carry this burden until death or discovery, whichever came first. For those who have ever felt trapped by circumstances beyond your control, who have experienced the claustrophobia of a life that has become a prison, the years after Michael's disappearance represented a particular kind of torture. Rebecca was not charged with any crime. She was not even officially a suspect, but she lived under suspicion nonetheless, in a community where her name had become synonymous with mystery and possible malice. The children grew. Connor became quieter, more isolated. He stopped having friends over to the house. Other parents, acting on instincts they could not quite name, discouraged their children from playing at the Jennings residence. Connor spent recesses alone, reading books in the corner of the playground. Teachers noted his intelligence but worried about his social development. Emma, despite her nightmares, maintained a cheerfulness that Rebecca found both touching and heartbreaking. The girl seemed determined to be happy, as though happiness could compensate for the absence of her father. She made cards for Rebecca on holidays, decorated with hearts and flowers and the words "I love you" in careful letters. She helped with chores without being asked. She hugged her mother fiercely and often, as though afraid Rebecca might disappear too. In 2008, Rebecca started dating a man she had met at a work conference in Manchester. His name was Thomas, and he lived 50 miles away, far enough that he knew nothing of Michael Jennings or the suspicions that followed Rebecca. They saw each other occasionally, always at his place, never at hers. She did not tell him about Michael for 3 months, and when she finally did, she presented it as a tragedy rather than a mystery. Her husband had disappeared. No one knew what happened. It was terrible. Thomas offered sympathy and did not press for details. The relationship lasted 6 months before Thomas ended it. He said the distance was too much, the complications too complex, but Rebecca suspected he had done his own research, had found the newspaper articles and online speculation, had decided he did not want to be involved with a woman who might have killed her husband. He did not say this explicitly, but his sudden withdrawal told its own story. By 2009, Rebecca had saved enough money to consider moving. She looked at houses in other towns, places where the Jennings name meant nothing, where she and her children could start fresh. But every time she came close to making an offer, she stopped. To move would be to run, and running would confirm guilt in the minds of those watching. So she stayed, trapped by pride and fear in equal measure. The 10th anniversary of Michael's disappearance passed with a small article in the local newspaper, reminding readers of the unsolved case and asking anyone with information to contact authorities. The article included an old photo of Michael, the same one that had run in earlier coverage. A snapshot from a work picnic, Michael standing beside his truck, squinting into the sun, unsmiling. Rebecca did not read the article. She knew what it would say. She knew the questions it would raise. She knew that 10 years had changed nothing except the depth of silence surrounding the truth. Connor was 15 now, a sophomore in high school, tall and thin and still painfully quiet. Emma was 13, entering 8th grade, still trying to compensate for the darkness with forced brightness. They never talked about their father. The subject had become forbidden by unspoken agreement, a wound too tender to touch. But children remember. Even when they do not speak of memories, even when they pretend to have forgotten, the past lives in them. Connor sometimes woke from dreams he could not recall, his heart racing, his sheets soaked with sweat. Emma developed habits of checking locks and windows before bed, needing reassurance that the house was secure, that nothing could get in or out without her knowledge. Rebecca noticed these behaviors but did not comment on them. To acknowledge them would be to open conversations she could not afford to have. So she maintained silence, the family's shared language, the only protection available against questions that had no safe answers. In 2012, a documentary filmmaker from Boston contacted Rebecca, wanting to make a film about unsolved disappearances in New England. Rebecca declined to participate. The filmmaker persisted, calling multiple times, sending letters, showing up at the dental practice. Rebecca finally threatened legal action, and the filmmaker retreated. But the attention had reminded the town of the case. People who had not thought about Michael Jennings in years suddenly remembered. Conversations at the coffee shop turned to speculation. Someone started a Facebook group dedicated to local mysteries, and Michael's case became a frequent topic. Armchair detectives analyzed old photos, mapped out timelines, proposed theories. The consensus among these amateur investigators was that Rebecca knew exactly what had happened, and someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. They were right, though the manner of emergence would surprise everyone. Part 4. The Revelation. Emma Jennings was 23 years old when she finally spoke. It was August of 2024, 18 years and 7 months after her father disappeared. She was living in Portland, Maine, working as a graphic designer, trying to build a life separate from the shadow of Berry Mill Road. She had been in therapy for 2 years, working through anxiety and depression, unpacking memories that had been locked away since childhood. During a session in early August, her therapist had been using a technique called EMDR, helping Emma process traumatic memories without being re-traumatized by them. They had been working on Emma's fear of abandonment, tracing it back to her father's disappearance. The therapist asked Emma to describe her last memory of her father. Emma closed her eyes. She followed the therapist's moving hand with her gaze, and suddenly, without warning, a memory surfaced that she had not accessed in 18 years. She was 3 years old, maybe almost 4. It was nighttime. She woke because she heard something, voices, raised voices, her mother and father. She got out of bed and walked to the hallway. She could see into the kitchen from where she stood. Her mother and father were standing close together. Her father was holding something, a bag. He was putting clothes into a bag. Her mother was crying. No, not crying. Her face was wet, but she was not making crying sounds. She was saying something. Emma could not remember the words, but she remembered the tone. Begging. Her father shook his head. He picked up the bag. Then there was a sound, a loud sound that made Emma jump. Her father fell, not slowly like in movies, quickly. One moment standing, the next moment on the floor. Her mother was holding something. Emma did not know what it was then, but she knew now, a gun. Her mother stood very still, holding the gun, looking at Emma's father on the floor. Then her mother saw Emma in the hallway. Clear's throat. Emma told her therapist what she had remembered. The therapist, bound by confidentiality but also by mandatory reporting requirements for certain crimes, faced an ethical dilemma. They discussed what Emma wanted to do. Emma said she needed to think. She went home and did not sleep. She called her brother Connor, who was living in Boston, working in it. She told him what she had remembered. Connor was quiet for a long time. Then he said he believed her. He said he had suspected something for years but had no evidence, no memories like Emma's. He asked what she was going to do. Emma said she thought she needed to go to the police. On August 15, 2024, Emma walked into the New Hampshire State Police Barracks in Concord and asked to speak to someone about her father's disappearance. She was directed to a detective named Marcus Rivera, who had recently been assigned to review cold cases. Rivera was 42, new to the unit, unfamiliar with the details of the Jennings case beyond the basic file notes. Emma sat across from Rivera and said, "I think my mother killed my father." Rivera asked her to explain. Emma recounted the memory that had surfaced during therapy. Rivera listened, taking notes, asking clarifying questions. When had this happened? January 2006, the night before her father was reported missing. How old had she been? 3. How certain was she that this was a real memory rather than something she had imagined or created? Emma said she was certain. The memory had the quality of truth, the weight of something that had been buried rather than invented. Rivera pulled the original case file. He read through Detective Chen's reports, the witness statements, the timeline discrepancies. He noted Chen's suspicions, the failed polygraph, the odometer irregularities. He looked at Emma and said, "This is going to be complicated." The investigation reopened officially on August 20th. Rivera contacted Detective Sarah Chen, now retired but still living in New Hampshire. Chen agreed to consult. Together, they reviewed the evidence with fresh eyes and Emma's testimony as a new framework. They obtained a warrant to search the property on Berry Mill Road. Rebecca no longer lived there. She had finally moved in 2015, selling the house to a young family from out of state. The new owners had made renovations, including replacing the kitchen floor, but the basement remained largely unchanged. On September 3rd, a forensic team spent 8 hours at the property. They brought ground-penetrating radar. They took samples from the basement floor, the dirt floor of the crawl space beneath the addition, the area around the foundation. They removed sections of wall where thermal imaging suggested possible cavities. In the crawl space, beneath 3 inches of dirt and 18 years of settling, they found remains. The medical examiner determined the remains were those of Michael Jennings through dental records. Cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the chest. The bullet, a 9mm, was recovered from the ribcage. Forensic analysis would later match it to a handgun registered to Rebecca Jennings, purchased in 2004, supposedly for home protection. On September 10th, Rebecca Jennings was arrested at her apartment in Nashua. She was charged with second-degree murder and falsifying physical evidence. She did not resist. When read her rights, she asked for an attorney and said nothing else. The news exploded across New Hampshire and beyond. The case that had gone cold 18 years earlier was suddenly front-page news again. Media trucks parked outside the state police barracks. Reporters tracked down everyone who had been involved in the original investigation. David Jennings gave a tearful interview, saying he had always known something was wrong, that his brother had deserved better, that justice was finally coming. Emma did not speak to the media. Neither did Connor. They released a joint statement through an attorney, saying they were cooperating with the investigation and asking for privacy. The trial began in March of 2025. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented Emma's testimony about what she had witnessed as a 3-year-old. They presented the forensic evidence, the remains, the bullet, the timeline discrepancies that Chen had noted 18 years earlier. They brought forward the coworker who had seen the house mostly dark on Friday night, suggesting something had happened before Rebecca claimed. They presented evidence that the truck had not been driven Saturday morning, contradicting Rebecca's story about Michael planning to plow snow. The defense argued that Emma's memory was unreliable, that recovered memories from early childhood were notoriously subject to suggestion and error. They argued that the forensic evidence was compromised by time and by the investigation's delay. They presented Rebecca as a victim of circumstance, a woman who had lost her husband and then been suspected for nearly 2 decades without evidence. But the prosecution had something the defense could not counter: Rebecca's own behavior. They presented testimony from people who had known the family, who described Rebecca's unusual composure after Michael's disappearance, her lack of emotion, her quick deletion of his presence from the house. They presented the failed polygraph. They presented the fact that Rebecca had never once in 18 years called the police with a tip or a theory or a desperate plea for them to search harder. The jury deliberated for 6 days. On April 2, 2025, they returned a verdict: guilty of second-degree murder, guilty of falsifying physical evidence. Rebecca showed no reaction when the verdict was read. She sat very still, hands folded on the table, eyes straight ahead. Later, when reporters asked her attorney if she had any comment, the attorney said only that they planned to appeal. Sentencing came in May. The judge, a woman named Teresa Wong who had presided over hundreds of criminal cases in her 30 years on the bench, spoke directly to Rebecca. She said that whatever had happened that night in January 2006, whatever had led Rebecca to pull the trigger, the subsequent 18 years of deception had compounded the tragedy. Michael's family had been denied closure. The community had been denied truth. Most importantly, Connor and Emma had grown up under the weight of their mother's secret, living in a house where their father's body lay hidden beneath their feet. Judge Wong sentenced Rebecca to 25 years to life. Rebecca was taken into custody immediately. As she was led from the courtroom, she turned and looked at the gallery where Emma and Connor sat beside their grandmother, Patricia, Michael's mother, who had waited 18 years for this moment. Rebecca's expression was unreadable. Was it regret, defiance, resignation? No one could say. The media coverage continued for weeks. True crime podcasts devoted episodes to the case. Online forums debated whether Emma's memory was reliable, whether Rebecca had planned the killing, or whether it had been a moment of passion, whether the sentence was too harsh or too lenient. But for those who had lived closest to the mystery, the trial's conclusion brought complicated emotions. Emma told a reporter, in one of her few public statements, that she felt relief that the truth was known, but also grief for the loss of both parents, the father she barely remembered, and the mother who had chosen deception over confession. Connor said he was glad his father could finally be properly buried, that the family could finally mourn openly. Patricia, Michael's mother, attended every day of the trial. She was 81 now, her health failing, but she sat in the same seat each day, watching the proceedings with fierce attention. When the verdict came, she wept. When asked by reporters if she felt justice had been served, she said, "My son is still gone. Nothing brings him back. But at least now we know. At least now we can rest." Michael Jennings was buried in the Thornfield Cemetery on a warm day in June 2025. The service was small, attended by family and a few old friends. Emma and Connor stood beside their grandmother as the casket was lowered into the ground. The headstone, simple granite, read, "Michael James Jennings, 1970-12006, beloved son and father." The house on Berry Mill Road, where Michael had died and been hidden, stood empty for 2 years before selling again. The new owners, unaware of its full history, painted it blue and planted gardens. The swing set was removed. The woodpile was cleared away. Life continued as it always does, layering new stories over old tragedies. Closing. The case of Michael Jennings became one of New Hampshire's most talked-about cold case resolutions, a reminder that truth can remain buried for years but rarely stays hidden forever. In the end, it was memory that unlocked the mystery, a child's witness finally speaking across the distance of 18 years. For those who study such cases, the Jennings disappearance offers lessons about the importance of persistent investigation, about the small details that do not fit, about the value of children's testimony, even when that testimony comes years after the fact. It reminds us that families can harbor terrible secrets, that ordinary houses on ordinary roads can conceal extraordinary darkness. Most importantly, it stands as testament to Michael Jennings himself, a quiet man whose life was ended too soon, whose absence echoed through years and lives, and who finally received the dignity of truth and burial that every person deserves. If this story mattered to you, subscribe and hit the bell. Share the episode. Someone somewhere may still be waiting to be heard.